Imagine it's the year 1300. Not 1900. 1300. Almost 800 years ago. In the Sahara Desert, in what is now Malí, a city exists that holds 700,000 handwritten manuscripts. 700,000. The Library of Alexandria had maybe 2 million at its peak. But here's what nobody tells you. Alexandria was chaos. Scattered, mixed languages, lost books everywhere. Timbuktu was different. Every single book organized, catalogued, preserved, and they were all still there. But Europe didn't just conquer Timbuktu. Europe erased that it ever existed. For 400 years, the world believed it was a myth, a legend, when it was more real than Paris, more advanced than London, more educated than anywhere in Europe. Stay with me because what I'm about to tell you will completely change how you see world history. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been taught that Africa had advanced empires, sophisticated cities, universities? Probably not. You know why? Because someone decided that wasn't convenient for you to know. In Timbuktu, in 1300, the Malí Empire ruled. Malí, say it, M-A-L-I. The most powerful man was Mansa Musa. Mansa, May-as-Ansa, Musa, Musa. This man was so wealthy that when he made a religious pilgrimage to Mecca, the journey cost so much gold that he collapsed the entire Mediterranean economy. That's not fiction. Arab historians documented it. The gold market in Egypt crashed, prices collapsed. One trip destroyed a region's economy, but the wealth wasn't the dangerous thing. The dangerous thing was what Timbuktu held. It held knowledge, real knowledge, true knowledge. The kind of knowledge that threatened everything Europe was building, and that's why they erased it. When you understand what Timbuktu really was, you'll see why the erasure was so complete and so deliberate. Let's start with the number. 700,000 manuscripts. That's not a typo. 700,000 individual written documents sitting in libraries, in homes, in universities throughout the city. For perspective, the Library of Alexandria, at its absolute peak, held somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million scrolls. But here's the crucial difference. Alexandria was fragmented. Manuscripts mixed, many lost. Timbuktu was organized. Every book catalogued. Every text preserved. And they were still there. In Europe, the largest library north of Rome contained maybe 5,000 volumes. Timbuktu had 700,000. That's 140 times larger. But that's not even the part that changed history. These manuscripts covered everything. Medicine, astronomy, mathematics, commercial law, Islamic theology. But mixed in were practical sciences that Europe wouldn't rediscover for 300 years. Mathematical treatises describing geometric principles that wouldn't appear in European universities until the Renaissance. Medical texts explaining blood circulation written 200 years before William Harvey claimed to discover it. The difference was simple. Timbuktu knew these things were true because they tested them, documented them, passed knowledge down. Europe had to reinvent everything from scratch, then claim they invented it first. All of this existed, all documented, all in Timbuktu in 1300, while Europe was still in medieval darkness. But something changed. Not in Timbuktu, in the world around it. Close your eyes. Imagine 1300. The Sahara Desert, the Niger River, say it, Niger, creates a region called the Sahel. Sahel. Green, water, life. You're walking toward Timbuktu. You see it from distance, not what you expect from Europe. Streets organized in perfect patterns. Buildings have multiple stories, flat roofs, white adobe walls gleaming under desert heat. Windows small and deep, made to keep heat out. Architects knew what they were doing. Water channels run throughout the city, not just main streets. Water reaches neighborhoods, gardens, Private homes. How many European cities had running water in 1300? Almost none. London had 30,000 people where sewer water ran openly through streets. Paris was a nest of infections and filth. Timbuktu, with between 100,000 and 250,000 people, had clean water systems. You walk through streets seeing merchants, vendors, scholars, people reading. On every corner, someone buying or selling books. In 1300 Europe, books were so rare, only the church owned them. Here in Timbuktu, books were common merchandise traded daily. There are 17 main libraries. The most important is the University of Sankore. Sankore, S-A-N-Kore. 140 professors, between 10,000 and 25,000 students depending on season. Oxford had maybe 2,000. Salamanca had 3,000. Timbuktu had double all of them combined. And what they taught there was something that terrified Europe. The scholars of Timbuktu didn't just teach religion. Of course, they taught the Quran, Islamic law, philosophy, but they also taught mathematics, astronomy, medicine, commercial law, geography. A geographer named Al-Idrisi wrote descriptions so precise about the African coast that they were more accurate than anything the Portuguese produced 100 years later. Those books were here in Timbuktu. Students read them, scholars improved them. There are astronomers here tracking star movements. Predicting lunar cycles with precision Europe wouldn't reach until the 16th century. Using instruments, recording data, doing real science. While Europe debated if the sun moved around the Earth, there are texts on surgery describing procedures Europe considered impossible for 2 centuries. Mathematics treatises with equations European mathematicians would reinvent from scratch. Books on commercial law describing economic principles Adam Smith would claim to invent in 1776. Think about that. While Europe was medieval darkness, Africa was advancing. While Europe burned people at the stake for reading wrong books, Timbuktu taught advanced mathematics and astronomy. While European kings were illiterate, Timbuktu had 25,000 university students. The knowledge gap wasn't what Europe told you it was. It was opposite direction, and Europe knew it. That's why what happened next was so systematic, so deliberate, so complete. But something changed, not in Timbuktu, in the world around it. Pay attention to this, it's crucial. In the 1400s and 1500s, the Portuguese begin sailing south, searching for a route to Indian spices. They don't care about Timbuktu. Timbuktu is inland, in desert. The Portuguese want coast, and they find gold on coast, ivory on coast, direct access to Indian merchants on coast. Slowly, the trade that made Timbuktu powerful diverts toward ocean, toward coast, toward Portuguese. Timbuktu doesn't disappear overnight. It begins losing importance. Merchants who brought books from Marrakesh, from Cairo, from throughout Islamic region, now go to coast instead of inland. Between 1400 and 1500, Timbuktu's importance drops. Slowly, steadily, the city that was the intellectual center of the world is becoming marginalized. Its power is fading. Its relevance is diminishing. And then, in 1591, something happens that historians call the end. The Sultan of Morocco looks south. He sees gold. He sees wealth. He sees a city once powerful but now slightly weaker because trade diverted. He makes a decision. He sends an army. The army crosses the Sahara. It arrives at Timbuktu, and Timbuktu falls. Not in months, in weeks. The Malí Empire, once invincible, cannot defend its greatest treasure. What follows is not just military conquest, it's systematic destruction. The armies march into the city and begin to destroy, burning buildings, looting treasures, desecrating temples. The destruction is comprehensive and merciless. It happens in weeks. Some historians say 3 weeks. The largest city in West Africa, the intellectual heart of the continent, is reduced to ruins in less than a month. Not in a single brutal siege. Through systematic, methodical destruction, the new Moroccan governors look at those 17 libraries, those 140 professors, those 25,000 students, and they see a problem that doesn't come from Timbuktu itself. It comes from fear that this knowledge, this education, this intellectual power might challenge their control. So they do what governments always do when they fear knowledge: they restrict. Some books sent to Marrakech as tribute, others locked away, most influential scholars removed from position. Slowly, the 17 open libraries begin closing. Between 1600 and 1650, what was one collection of 700,000 manuscripts begins scattering. Some scholars sell books to travelers, trying to preserve them. Some bookkeepers hide collections in private homes. Some manuscripts damaged by climate. Some lost completely. The collection doesn't disappear all at once, but it fragments, it scatters. And that was enough for it to be lost. But here's what actually erased Timbuktu from world memory. It wasn't the Moroccan invasion. Something more insidious happened. Something that took 400 years of deliberate rewriting. Something that involved the most powerful institutions in the world deciding that a civilization's knowledge was too inconvenient to acknowledge. And that decision changed the course of human history. Between the years 1600 and 1800, while Timbuktu was fragmenting under Moroccan control, Europe was doing something different. Europe was rewriting history. Arab historians had documented everything about Timbuktu: how wealthy it was, how educated, how advanced. Those documents existed. They were recorded, accessible if you knew where to look. But European historians in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s looked at those Arab reports and said, "It's not true. These are exaggerations, legends. Probably wasn't like that." And because Europe controlled the printing press, because Europe controlled what got written in history books, because Europe controlled what was taught in schools, because Europe had the political and military power, what they said became truth. Timbuktu went from being a documented historical city to being a legend, a mythology, something that probably wasn't as important as people claimed. They literally rewrote history, and their version became the official story. For 400 years, Timbuktu was something between a myth and a whisper. Something explorers heard about but never confirmed. Something that probably didn't exist quite as grandly as stories suggested. Think about that for a moment. An entire city, an entire civilization, deliberately forgotten, on purpose, because acknowledging its existence would have made colonialism, slavery, and exploitation much harder to justify. That's not accidental forgetting. That's systematic erasure. And it worked perfectly. The world forgot. Europe's version became the truth, and nobody questioned it for 400 years. Why would they do this? Why rewrite history on purpose? Because if the world knew that Africa had sophisticated cities, if people understood that Africa had universities, if history recorded that Africa possessed advanced knowledge, then the entire narrative Europe was creating would collapse. The narrative was this: Africa has no civilization. Africa has no knowledge. Africa is wild land waiting to be civilized. This justifies why Europe can conquer it. This justifies why Europe can enslave its people. This justifies why Europe can take its resources. Timbuktu was a threat to that narrative. So they erased it completely. For 300 years, Timbuktu wasn't taught in schools, wasn't written in textbooks, wasn't acknowledged in academic circles. Scholars who studied Africa were told to ignore reports of advanced civilizations. The official position was that Africa was primitive, that it always had been, that it always would be until Europe arrived to civilize it. The printing press, controlled by Europeans, disseminated this narrative everywhere. The universities, controlled by Europeans, taught it as fact. The governments, controlled by Europeans, used it to justify what they were about to do. And what they were about to do was horrible. Slavery, colonization, resource extraction, genocide. all justified by a narrative that said Africa was incapable of building civilization. If Timbuktu existed, if it was as advanced as the records claimed, then that narrative collapsed. So the records had to be wrong, the reports had to be exaggerated, the history had to be rewritten. Not until the 1800s did European historians finally admit Timbuktu really existed. But by then, 400 years of propaganda had done its work. The damage was permanent. Timbuktu had been erased from human consciousness, and the world had lost something incalculable. The collection of 700,000 manuscripts had been reduced to between 100,000 and 200,000. 70% of the knowledge was lost, gone, not destroyed by war or conquest, lost to time, climate, deliberate neglect, and systematic suppression. The world had lost 400 years. 400 years in which, if Europe had known what Timbuktu knew, history would be different. The scientific revolution would have arrived earlier, medicine would have advanced faster, mathematical knowledge would have been more precise, understanding of the world would be deeper. But it wasn't just time that was lost. It was the very idea that Africa had achieved advanced civilization. That was lost. The confirmation that knowledge develops everywhere humans settle with freedom and resources, that was lost. The proof that Europe's claim to superiority was manufactured rather than earned, that was lost. Instead, the world believed the narrative. Africa was primitive. Europe was advanced. This difference was natural. This difference was racial. This difference justified everything. For 400 years, this lie shaped the world. It shaped how nations were carved up. It shaped which people were considered fully human. It shaped the distribution of wealth and power. It shaped centuries of suffering, and it was all built on the erasure of a single city. A city that had libraries while Europe had monasteries. A city that had universities while Europe had kingdoms ruled by illiterate kings. A city that had advanced mathematics while Europe was debating astrology. But knowledge doesn't die completely. It goes underground. It hides. It waits. And sometimes, 800 years later, it re-emerges. And when it does, it changes everything we thought we knew about who built civilization and why. In the year 2015, something extraordinary happened. A team of researchers was working in Timbuktu. They found a house. Inside, a private family had guarded 300 manuscripts. 300 books protected for 400 years. Passed generation after generation, kept in secret. Waiting. When these books were translated, what they found was beyond extraordinary. These weren't just ancient texts. These were living records. Letters between scholars debating ideas, notes on medical procedures, observations about star movements, mathematical calculations, treatises on how to live together, how to trade, how to govern. What they discovered was an entire city thinking, a community of minds working together, questioning, advancing, growing. A woman named Abdelkader Haidara had kept those manuscripts safe. Her family had been the guardians. They protected knowledge when no one else cared, when the world forgot. When history was rewritten, they kept the truth. And finally, 800 years later, that truth was heard again. Today we know Timbuktu was real. We know it was advanced. We know it was educated. We know it was powerful. Not because Europe told us, but because Timbuktu itself kept evidence. The 700,000 manuscripts didn't disappear. Families protected them. Scholars hid them. And in the 21st century, the truth returned. What happened to Timbuktu is a lesson in how power works, in how history gets written, in how truth can be buried but not destroyed. The libraries were destroyed not by ignorance but by politics. They were erased not because they contained false information, but because they contained true information that threatened the narrative Europe wanted to create. If you want to understand why the world is shaped the way it is, you have to understand Timbuktu. You have to understand what happens when a civilization's knowledge is deemed inconvenient. You have to understand what it costs to rewrite history, and you have to understand that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually re-emerges. And if this has moved you, if this has made you think differently about the history you were taught, if this has made you curious about what else might have been erased, I want you to know that I have more stories like this. I have stories about cities that were larger than any European capital, and nobody remembers their names. I have stories about civilizations that achieved things Europe wouldn't catch up to for centuries. I have stories about knowledge that was deliberately hidden, about history that was deliberately rewritten. If you want to explore these stories with me, if you want to understand the world the way it actually was, rather than the way we were taught it was, I'd love for you to join me here on this channel. Every week, I'm uncovering another story that the world tried to forget. The next one is about a city built in the middle of America, larger than London, advanced beyond belief, and today, almost nobody knows it existed. Its name had been completely erased, but we're bringing that history back. I hope you'll come with me to discover it. Thank you for watching, truly.